to today. So let me just get show my screen. I just really want to say exciting to see. I love when people write in where they're from. So we've got people from Vancouver, from Iowa, from Australia. So, and I'm actually calling in from Boston today. And I really want to welcome you to this really exciting webinar about creating sexually safer congregations by Reverend Debra Hafner. And before I turn this over to Debra, I just want to take a moment to tell you all about NERI Press. Our mission, as you may know, is to share sort of cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. And for many years, we did that by basically selling books. But with changes in both the publishing industry and the technology world, we're exploring what it means to maintain our mission while moving towards a definition of ourselves as a sort of knowledge dissemination organization. And over the last 5 years, we played around with offering online courses, free newsletters, some face-to-face workshops, as well as these series of webinars from some of our internationally recognized authors. And unlike many other publishers, each of us at NERI Press is actually a professional working with you in the field. So we really welcome and appreciate your engagement with us, your feedback, and just contact us with your questions, your critiques, and suggestions. I think that's how we will be better at what we do. So just out of curiosity, I want to do a quick poll and ask how many people have participated in a NERI Press webinar before. And Greg, would you mind just putting this poll on the screen? And Greg, for some reason, if you can just go online, because great. So what are we seeing? Okay. Great. Well, then, welcome back to the people who've done these before, and we really welcome the folks who are new, because I know for me personally this is a topic which is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more at the end, but just to say, if you find these webinars useful and helpful, we ask you to consider becoming a sponsor of this series. Just like NPR, it's your donation that helps us make this series happen. We just posted our 2015-16 webinar series. So if you become a sponsor now, you can guarantee yourself a seat at the table. We can register you. It all comes very conveniently. And we also give you a free gift of 2 of our books, Current Perspectives and Current Applications. And then this year, we're also offering you CE credits. So it really is a win-win situation for all of us. And again, we appreciate your support, and I will talk more about the details at the end. I want to, before we get started, also go through sort of the housekeeping. And sort of like with any workshop that you'd be taking, we have learning objectives. First is to help you identify criteria for what it means to be a safer congregation. Second, to talk about the processes for deciding how a sex offender can be included within a faith community, if that's something that the congregation wants to consider. And third, identify how sexual abuse treatment experts can sort of actively partner with faith communities. Second, I just want to let you know that the PowerPoint for today is actually posted on the NERI Press website, so you can definitely look at that right away, access that, or access afterwards. We'll also be posting a recording of this webinar next week, and you'll be getting a notice when that's posted. Third, I'm going to say that when the workshop is over, be sure to close out your account, because we will be sending you an evaluation. Again, we really appreciate and love your feedback, so please be sure to close out so that we can send that to you. And last, and just as stated previously, we now offer CE credits for psychologists and social workers for these webinars. So if you're interested, you can just find the instructions on the NERI Press webinar page, and they'll tell you how to do it for just a fairly nominal cost. So it really is my pleasure to introduce Debra. I've known Debra for, I was trying to think, at least 15 years. And I'd say that every conversation, every time I've had a chance to work with Debra, I've always learned and been challenged by all of our conversations. Reverend Haffner is the president of the Religious Institute on Sexual Morality, Justice, and Healing, and she's a sexologist for more than 40 years. She was ordained as a Unitarian Universalist minister in 2003 and is endorsed by the Unitarian Church in Westport. She's also the author of several guides for congregations on sexuality, as well as 2 award-winning books for parents, From Diapers to Dating, A Parent's Guide to Raising Sexually Healthy Children, and also Beyond the Big Talk, Every Parent's Guide to Raising Sexually Healthy Teens. I can say as a parent that these are fabulous books. And also Debra and I collaborated a number of years ago on creating an online training program about creating safer congregations. And this training is called Balancing Act and is one of the free Neary Press online workshops that you can find on our website. So I also want to take a moment to just talk about A Time to Heal, which you can purchase through Neary Press. This is about protecting children and ministering to sex offenders. Her book is a primary resource, I think, for congregations in dealing with sexual abuse issues. It provides tools for faith communities and helps develop sexual abuse prevention strategies, determine if and how a convicted sex offender can be involved in a congregation, and also decide how to respond if a member is accused of a sexual offense, and then make sure that there's adequate support for victims and survivors when you're trying any of this. So it's a great resource. Again, you can find it on our website. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Debra to take us away on a really wonderful conversation about how to work within faith communities. So welcome, Debra.
Thank you. Can you all see the slides now?
We can see the slides. I can't see you yet, but I can see the slides, yes.
Okay. I think so. I hope you can see me. Yes. Welcome to all of you, and thank you to Neary, and special thanks to Joan Tabachnick, who, as she said, we've been partnering directly for at least a decade. I do want to tell you all that I am not a psychologist. I'm a public health trained person and have been a certified sexuality educator for the last 4 decades. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to engage in this conversation today. Before I begin talking specifically about our new Sexually Safer Congregations project, I just wanted to tell you a bit about the Religious Institute. We are 14 years old next week. We're a national U.S.-based not-for-profit organization that works on a multi-faith basis to advocate for sexual justice in America's faith communities and in society. We are a network of more than 7,000 religious leaders who come from every state in the United States, as well as 12 other countries. And we have been working on sexual abuse prevention for basically all of the time of our existence. And Joan told you a little bit about some of the projects we've done before. I know that you all are very familiar with the statistics on abuse and the high prevalence of abuse among children and adolescents, as well as in history of adults. What you may be less familiar with is the amount of abuse that has happened actually in a faith community, as sad and soul-scarring as that is. So studies show that there's now documentation that at least 7% of U.S. priests have been found to have sexually abused a child. Interestingly, when I've told other groups about that, people often think it's much higher. I find 7% very disturbing. And in a study done by Diana Garland at Baylor University that asked women who were currently attending a religious community, so these are women who are currently going to worship, currently engaged in a community, in a congregation, 3% of those women say that they have been a victim of clergy sexual misconduct. Over 90% of that were relationships that were done in private and in secret by the clergy involved. That number is of women who currently go to religion. We can guess that many, many women have stopped attending religious institutions as a result of being violated by a clergy person. What the Garland study found is that, in fact, no religion, no denomination has been immune from that kind of abuse. We started working on, I've been working on sexually safer congregations practices as part of looking at how to make congregations sexually healthy and responsible. And frankly, even in the most progressive denominations, what we found was that the faith world has not made the safety of children, teenagers, vulnerable adults, indeed all adults, a high priority in their congregations. I initially conceived of the idea of trying to create a designation project similar to what many of you may know, which is the welcoming and affirming congregations that publicly announce and have gone through a process that they are going to be open and welcoming to gay and lesbian and in some cases bisexual and transgender people. We heard from legal authorities and our legal counsel that in fact such a designation would not be wise, and so we've retooled the project a little bit. But our major focus in this project is that we believe that a concentration on how a congregation can be free of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and religious professional sexual misconduct is an issue for all congregations, regardless of their theology, regardless of whether they are liberal or conservative, regardless of their denomination, that every religious institution, just like every youth institution, just like every school institution, needs to be aware of what are the policies and practices that need to be in place in order to keep people free from abuse, harassment, and misconduct. So we've undertaken in the last 6 months a very major new initiative, and actually you were one of the first groups to hear about it. I began with doing an extensive literature review and reviewing the policies that denominations had already passed on safer congregations. I then did a survey with more than 20 denominations and faith-based organizations. We looked at all of and there's quite a bit out there of what are safe congregations materials that currently exist. And I collated a list of 80 plus items that a safe congregation might undertake. 80 items is a huge amount to ask any congregation to do. So what we did was we put together a group of the nation's experts on sexual abuse prevention in congregation life. And we held a one-day colloquium, and we're very grateful that Joan was one of the participants in that. That group spent the day looking at what were the best practices that every congregation should have in place. And so we have now culled those 80 items down into a list of 18 best practices. Right in the moment, we are developing a web-based self-assessment for congregations and a website to go with that. And I'll tell you more about that at the end. We conducted this survey of 16 denominations and six related faith organizations, and I'm going to share the results with you, but I haven't published them yet, and so this piece is preliminary and not to be quoted. What we found first is that a few denominations, most notably the Community of Christ, which you may or may not know is one of the original Mormon groups, not the Mormons in Salt Lake City, but the Mormons in Missouri, but who are spread out all over the country now. The Presbyterian Church of the USA and the United Methodist Church are the three denominations that have really made an outstanding commitment to safer congregation programs and policies. What we found, which was really fascinating, is that the other mainline Protestants, so the evangelical Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the American Baptist congregation, and indeed the Southern Baptists, basically have delegated safer congregations work to the insurance companies that provide insurance to their individual congregations. The impact of that is that the programs tend to be only about risk reduction from an insurance point of view, rather than about empowering young people or doing education for the congregation on a broad range of sexuality issues. So that they're very much about how do you avoid anyone suing you, rather than what do we need to do to empower people to be safe. We also found in the survey that almost no denominations have a budget for this issue, have staff with responsibility for their safer congregation. Very few have expectations for congregational implementation, so people could not tell me how many congregations in their denominations actually have a safer policy or a safer program. And there were very limited website materials, except again for links to these insurance companies' information. And so what we were really interested in looking at was how, in fact, can we motivate the denominations and their congregations to become more involved. We started with the question of what then should congregations do, and first began, as you do, and there may be people on the phone who work with religious organizations, with what are the strong theological principles that would underlie this work. And indeed, at least from a Jewish and Christian framework, there are strong theological principles that we should love our neighbor as ourselves, that we need to have a commitment to protecting the vulnerable and the most marginalized in the culture, that our religious leaders need to be held accountable for their actions. And also that our faiths call for a promise of restoration and reconciliation that can underscore the work that we are asking congregations to do related to sexual offenders. Often theology in Jewish and Christian context starts with looking at the Bible. And I'm not going to spend too long on this, but I was particularly fascinated about the fact that when we look across the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, there is both a incredible amount in the Bible about sex outside of monogamous heterosexual marriage. And there are extensive stories of sexual abuse and violation in the Bible. We see stories of rape, stories of harassment, stories of professional misconduct, and many stories of people exploiting their sexuality and indeed that having consequences. But interestingly, there's not a single story in the Bible that talks about childhood sexual abuse or its prevention. In fact, of note, the Holiness Code in the book of Leviticus, which is probably best known to many of you for its prohibitions of male same-sex sexual contact, in the Holiness Code, they lay out a large number of people who you are not supposed to be having sex with, including relatives and neighbors and relatives of relatives. But there is no explicit prohibition about sex with children. Nor is there anything explicit on a prohibition of parent-child incest. And surely it was not because that wasn't known at the time or that it wasn't happening. Indeed, the Code of Hammurabi, which was written at about the same time, explicitly bans parent-child of the opposite sex intercourse. And so we've been really looking at what is the why of that? How were children understood to be treated? This passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verse 42, is the passage most often cited in religious texts for what underscores a safer congregation. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. But what's important is it's not just theological values that underscore the program, but I think we can also turn to what in the sexuality education field what we call universal values, values that are held by most people in most cultures, despite, of course, the difficulty for speaking for any one particular culture, especially one that's not your own. So some of those universals are that safety is a birthright, that sexuality is a life-giving gift, but one that can be also exploited, and that everyone has dignity and worth, which becomes particularly important when we look at integrating people with a history of offenses into congregations, as well as the fact that most people believe that people can be redeemed. Perhaps more persuasive, certainly to the insurance companies that are now supporting much of this work, are the practical reasons to have congregations get involved. You all probably know from newspaper reports that the Roman Catholic Church has lost millions and millions of dollars, and dioceses and congregations have actually had to go out of business as a result of claims related to sexual abuse. There's a very important message that I'll return to a few times in this presentation of how important it is to help congregations as well as the other institutions we work at understand that having prevention policies is better than trying to create policies in the middle of a crisis. often when I get calls from a congregation, and I consult with many of them each month, on having had someone either arrested for, say, internet pornography use, or finding out that somebody in the congregation is on the sex offender list, or having a treatment provider refer someone to the congregation, is that when I ask people before we talk about this particular incident that you're wrapped up in right now, can you tell me about your safer congregation policy? People kind of pause and say, actually, I think we did that 10, 15 years ago. I'll have to go see if I can find it. And so we really want to help congregations think about how in advance they need to be preparing and preventing abuse. So as I said earlier, the colloquium helped us move from 80 policies to 18, and I want to start sharing those with you. The policy components break down into these. So looking at sexual harassment prevention, religious leaders training and expectations, what do we expect of staff and volunteers in the clinic, what should be part of our religious education programs, how do we minister to sex offenders, and how and what should be in policies about online use and technology. So we'll go quickly through those. The first set of things are really about procedures to underline a congregation commitment to safer congregation programs. That there should be well-written policies that cover these issues. Those policies should be well publicized, and that this should be a living document. So the fact that you create a policy in 2015 does not mean that you are done forever, but that in fact it needs to be reviewed on an every year basis, that it needs to become a living part of the congregation. Surprisingly, very few congregations have sexual harassment policies, but every congregation I know of and every clergy person that I work with and every seminarian who I've trained brings up issues related not only to how should staff behave, but what happens when you have somebody who hugs too hard during the receiving line? What happens about the congregant who is recently separated or divorced and decides they're going to date their way through the congregation? Who goes around during the coffee hour and tells sexually explicit jokes to anybody who they can get their attention of. And so we're really encouraging congregations to look at sexual harassment policies for the staff in the personnel policies, but that the youth group develop them for how they treat each other, that there be a congregant-to-congregant policy with clear procedures for if someone is making you feel uncomfortable, how do you report that and what will happen, and then to look at whether the congregation has a disruptive persons policy for people who really need to have their behaviors discussed by a board of trustees as to how they can be there safely without making other people uncomfortable. Almost every denomination has a code of conduct for clergy. Few actually extend that code to religious educators or to the musicians or administrators who work in congregations. And very few congregations really seem to know what the code of conduct is. So we are encouraging in these criteria that code be known to the congregation, including how to report concerns both within the congregation, but also to the denomination in cases of clergy misconduct. The clergy, as well as the other professional staff, the administrators, the musicians, the religious educators, need to have sexual abuse and harassment training, not just on the no, don't have sex with the people in your congregation, but more importantly, or as importantly, how to handle their own feelings of attractions to congregants, how to set boundaries, and how to handle congregants' sooner or later expected attractions to the clergy person as a charismatic religious leader. There are a variety of things that need to happen for those people who work in religious education, or what you may know as Christian education or Sunday school, including them completing a comprehensive screening form, doing background checks on all who work with children, having training on sex abuse, How long should somebody be in the congregation before they're allowed to be with children? One of the things we talk about is if somebody comes brand new to your congregation and the first thing they say is, I can't wait to work with your children, that in fact should be a red flag. One of the biggest resistances we've had with congregations is looking at young people, teenagers volunteering either as teachers, and so we encourage that, in fact, when youth work with children directly, they be paired with an adult, and that there be policies for babysitters, that babysitters should be screened, they should be educated about abuse prevention, and they should work with adult supervision. Most congregations readily accept that there should be two unrelated adults in the classroom, at the choir practice, on the field trip, although for the smallest congregations that becomes problematic because they simply don't have enough volunteers. One of the things that also has surprised me is how few congregations actually know what's expected of them in terms of reporting of suspected abuse. And I'll talk about your potential role in that in a minute. In today's world, what has become particularly important, especially in light of Megan's Law, and especially in light of internet pornography stings, is that the churches are now being faced, if they have not already, they will be, I think, in the next 5 years, to how they can welcome a person who's been accused of a sexual impropriety or a person with a history of sexual offenses. This is work that Joan has helped me with many years ago, and I have a book called A Time to Heal that's available both through the Institute and NERI on how do we decide whether and when to minister to sex offenders. Generally, when this comes up in a congregation, it's a crisis, and so we're trying to help congregations have the policies in place and have thought through these issues. How do we engage experts like you all in assessing whether a person is safe to be in a congregation? One of the points I make regularly to ministers is that they are not equipped and should not be doing that risk assessment by themselves, that they need to be consulting with family and parole officers and therapists and treatment providers to see, is this person somebody who can be there safely or not? The most effective thing, if the answer to that is yes, under some circumstances, is the creation of what's called a limited access agreement. Each of those must be tailored to the individual based on what they've been accused of or what their offense or history is. The bottom line on the limited access agreement is to keep both the offender or the person accused safe from further allegations, as well as to keep the children in the congregation safe. The reality is that children view the adults in a congregation as safe people, as trusted adults. And so we want to give a message to people who have a history of offenses against children, for example, that they are not to pass the peace to children. They're not to talk to children in their community. They're not to volunteer for education or intergenerational activities, that they need to be in the presence of someone who knows them and knows their past. And what's not in my book, In Balancing Acts, which, and A Time to Heal, which we wrote back in 2005, 2006, is I think is most of these people should also not be allowed to bring their cell phones with their internet access and their camera into the building, nor use congregational computers. All of that also raises the question that we need to look at technology and safety now in congregations. As you all know, and this graphic shows, there are infinite numbers of ways that people are accessing information that were unknown and unheard of. Well, some of these are, you know, in the case of things like Snapchat, are brand new, but certainly within the last 10 years, we have seen this explosion of technologies, and congregations really have not addressed what their role is. And so having them look at things like who should friend who, whether adult members can interact with minors online, what about adult staff members, do you need to make copies, how do we post photos? How do we keep the children and people in the congregation safe? Do we tag people? Youth minister I worked with last week said to me, I am completely overwhelmed by having to keep up on what the young people in my congregation are doing in technology. And so it becomes a real issue on what is the policy and what are the expectations. I think it's particularly important to, in terms of preventing sexual abuse of both children and teenagers, is how should adult and youth respond to each other. So the importance of looking at adult interaction, both staff interactions, but also volunteer interaction, and how on church-based Facebook groups, on other ways that we relate to young people, how are we monitoring and supervising, and what are our expectations for young people? So where are we now? We've developed, as I said, these 18 best practice criteria, and we are in the process of developing an online self-assessment process for congregations and a safer seal. We've begun working with three major denominations, the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Metropolitan Community of Churches, and the National Evangelical Hispanic Leadership Conference on how to adopt the policies and the procedures for their groups. And we are hopefully, there will be other denominations that will also engage. We're developing a web-based presence of best practices, links, and templates so people don't feel like they have to start on their own. And then we'll be pilot testing that with congregations of different sizes. Our hope is that the national rollout will occur certainly by September, if not sooner. We are seeking funding for this project, and I would be delighted if any of you had ideas for how we can take this project to the next step. We were supported for its development, but have yet to obtain funding for its rollout. I want to conclude, before we open it up for questions, is to really talk with you about what you, and assuming that many of you are treatment providers or parole officers, or experts in educators, experts in some ways on child sexual abuse prevention or the treatment of offenders, and encourage you to reach out to the faith communities in your area. If you are a member of a faith community, please, please, please let the congregation and the minister or the rabbi or the imam know about your expertise and step up to help create the safer program. You can help them with assessment. So if somebody comes forward and we need to find out, is that person, how do we consider whether that person is safe to be in a congregation? Can you do assessments, and can you do them at lower cost? Because I tell congregations that they in fact have to pay for them. Can you offer training for congregational staff? Particularly, I think congregation staff need help recognizing signs and symptoms of abuse, signs and symptoms of abusers, and how to respond if somebody reveals that they have a history or are currently being sexually abused. At what point, what can the clergy person or the head of religious education do to help that person, support that person before they engage authorities? Education programs on prevention would be welcome in most congregations, and referrals actually work both ways. I would encourage you to find out what congregations in your area are open to serving people with a history of offenses or people who've served time in prison, so that you can create relationships with them. But also, congregations can refer to you because as a clergy person, we uncover people or people come to us who have difficulties managing their own sexual attractions, who are concerned about them, or who perhaps have had a history of abuse, as well as survivors all of whom could use your support. I'd love to keep you informed about the project as it rolls out. And so if you are interested, if you would send a note to info@religiousinstitute.org and put Safer Congregations in the subject line, we will know to send you information once our web-based materials are available so you can help spread the word about the project. Or you can go to our Religious Institute website right now and sign up for our email list where these notices will also come out. And that brings me to, I have a note that said be finished by 3:35. So we will open this up, Joan, for questions.
Fabulous. Debra, that really was wonderful as always. And I really think that sort of just the underlying value that you bring to this, and I think that faith organizations bring to this always is that you can't throw people away. And that's just begins such a different discussion. So just thank you for starting that. And just want to encourage your audience, if you do have questions, you can still write them in, and we'll try to get to as many of them, as possible. Just maybe to begin the conversations, I want to just say that people have been writing in some really wonderful resources, and someone has mentioned that that actually in Jewish law that there is sort of a construct that you're not supposed to have sex with a girl before her menses. So that is written. So there are places where it sounds like if we dig deep enough that there are some prohibitions, but I think that it doesn't belie what you said, that just in general the Bible doesn't address this issue. But there's some great resources. Someone mentioned around screening. There's a group that I had never heard of called presearchus.com. And there's also someone asked you, Debra, if you're familiar with the Samaritan Safe Church initiative that's taking place in Pennsylvania. And Debra, I don't know if you have any comments on that, or if you've heard of that, but that's something that people certainly I'm interested now in finding more about.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, if you have some thoughts about that, that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I just got a note about something that flashed. The Samaritan Counseling Project in Pennsylvania, which was funded by the MDiv Foundation, I think is a really fabulous, intensive project that I actually have only found out about in the last month, and wish I had known about because I would have loved to have had them be part of our colloquium. They require a year's commitment by a congregation, including very intensive training and a commitment to, I believe, 6 or so sessions at the congregation on education. And I think for congregations that are willing to make that commitment, it's a terrific program. My experience with congregations is that they know they're not doing enough, and yet they're not willing to make the kind of cultural shift that project requires, given all the competing demands that are going on in a congregation. So what we hope to do is that our project will both refer to people who want that kind of intensive experience, and that will develop some collaboration with them. Our 18 criteria are seen as kind of minimal criteria that need to be in place, and we're asking congregations to meet 3/4 of those. So it's kind of the entry step. We would hope congregations, once they do this, would actually get more involved.
Thank you. So someone else had talked about, asked about, so once abuse has occurred, can you just simply give, and this is, I guess, the assumption is that that they haven't taken your advice and put the policies in place ahead of time. How do you move people towards prevention when they're in the middle of that crisis? Do you have any sort of thoughts or suggestions on that, Debra?
Well, first of all, you don't. In public health, we call it tertiary. In public health, we talk about primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. And tertiary prevention is when you're trying to do your work in the middle of a crisis. So I think we encourage congregations to slow down, that it is okay to say to somebody, we don't have a policy, and we don't want to deal with you as this issue as an isolated case. So for the next period of time, whether that's a month or 2 months, while we figure this out, we're going to ask you not to come, but I will offer you as a clergy person ongoing ministry, or we will ask you to only come to adult-only events, depending on what the congregation is doing, while we figure this out. I think what I've often said to congregations is that when you finish getting through the crisis, that will be the time then to talk to the congregation about the fact that this would have all gone better and easier and with less franticness if in fact there was a policy, and that there is going to be a next time. And so can we take the steps now to both work on what do we have to do to prevent these occurrences, and how will we have in place the policies if somebody else is accused, or if we get a call that someone's being released from prison, that we could say, as we have in my own congregation, we don't need to panic. We have a policy and we have procedures, and let's pull the response team together.
Yeah, and I think that, the more we talk about the crises that are in various synagogues and churches, I think that that's actually become more and more of a motivator for those churches and synagogues who don't have policies yet. Because I think it is a question of not, if this will happen, but really when, and are we prepared? So I do appreciate that sort of sense of community. Greg, maybe you can help us with this a little bit. It's that someone asked if we could have the information on the screen again of how to find out more about the Religious Institute. So can you switch it back over to Debra, and maybe we can leave that as the discussion slide so people can see that and write that down and have time for that. So my next question here, is that possible, Greg? Great.
And yeah, so I want to go back one slide, I guess.
Yeah, that'd be great. So thanks for everybody's patience in our technology changes here. And just to say, there's some great resources, as Debra's doing that, there's some great resources that people are writing in. And I think what we'll try to do is actually, rather than sort of trying to say this in our discussion, what we're going to do is we'll collect all these resources and just put them as a resource list on our website. So if you are part of them, part of a congregation that's doing some great work, or you have some resources to share, type that in. We're not going to necessarily cover that today, but we will make sure that gets posted on the website, and we'll give everybody a link to that when we send things out. So, just to say that we really appreciate, Bonnie, Nicholas, you just sent in some great information I didn't know about, so we'll continue to do that.
And so, Joan, what I want to really encourage people, if you know of stuff, we are really trying to curate the best website we can for congregations, showing them that the policies and procedures and manuals that are already out there that they can use as resources. So I would very much encourage you, and I would love to have them.
Yes, we'll definitely make sure you get them, Debra. And actually, one of the questions here was that do you have some specific policies that you recommend as part of the work that you do, Debra?
I would love for that to be more specific. In our book, A Time to Heal, we do have some screening forms, and we do lay out what we think are the best practice policies. Many of the denominations have policies and procedures on their website. I would say, in particular, I'm impressed with the United Methodist Church, which has a separate website on these issues, which is at umsexualethics.org. And they have done a really fantastic program of laying out information for their congregations. I also really think the Community of Christ has done an outstanding job, and they actually even have, one of the things they do is they require every youth leader has to go through Safer Congregations training and be certified by them before they see young people. And they actually have posters to put in your clinic that tell you that all of these people have been certified. So those are some. I obviously like our resources. The resources of an organization called the Faith Trust Institute are excellent. I think Neri's resources, Stop It Now's resources. So there's quite a bit out there.
Yeah. And again, we will collect a resource list that people are sending in, and I really encourage people to go to Debra Haffner's website as well. Someone asked about, I think, something which I've heard certainly over the years, and that the whole question of mandated reporting requirements, and what advice do you have for clergy in particular to encourage communication and openness, but also make sure that you understand what those mandated reporting requirements are and act on the safety of the community in that context?
So, Joan, you know it probably better than I, that the states are highly individual. And so Pennsylvania, for example, now has a very strict law. And congregations in Pennsylvania are scrambling to figure out how to meet the new requirements, not just so much for reporting, but also for screening and background checking. clergy have a very delicate role. So in many, many states, but not all, clergy are mandated reporters, and different states have different requirements. And again, we need to know what the requirements are in our state. The delicacy of is that in counseling is trying to assess what's the situation, what's the risk that's going on, how do we support all the members of the family, including both potentially a victim and a perpetrator, and when do we ask for involvement of officials? And it's a place I think that clergy really do need training. Particularly what clergy have told me is that they have not been trained, and this does not come up in most seminary training, which does not include sex abuse prevention nor sexuality often, is how, in fact, to even have that discussion. When somebody says to you, I think this child is being abused, the clergy person has an obligation to respond, but many of them really don't have the skills. And so, again, this is a place where I think the people on this call and people who are members of APSA and other groups really could play a very important role in working with local congregations on helping clergy figure out what it is they need to do when, and what are the skills that, and the kinds of questions and the kind of discussions we should be having.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize something which you say all the time, which is like it's so important to know what the policies are before any allegation is made or before a child discloses.
Not just for the one of the things that I feel really strongly about is it's not just for the clergy person, but some congregations have hundreds of volunteers who work with young people, and they're really the first line of defense. So they need to know what's expected of them and who to go talk to and what will happen next.
So that sort of ties into another question here, which is when a child discloses abuse but doesn't want to be public information, what are sort of the policies in place? How can a church respond so that the allegation can be that basically can be reported, but that there's the public part of that is contained in some way?
Yeah.
And I think inherent is that is sort of that part of the allegation may be against someone else in the congregation or a family member or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, again, I think each states are going to vary tremendously on that. I think knowing when or whether to engage the authorities becomes important. Clearly, the safety of the child is most important. And one of the, I think, tough things that perhaps many people on this call don't face, and I didn't face until I was a clergy person, is that our commitment is to working with all the members of that family. And so it becomes really important to, be able to say, particularly if we're talking about a child or a young person, this is the kind of situation that I need to make sure is not just between you and me, but we need to get your parents involved. I need to get your parents in here. I need to, depending on what's going on, I encourage congregations to have committees of experts who are from the congregation who can assist. I would hate for a clergy person to be holding all this by themselves without people to talk to. I think getting people, treatment providers in the community involved may become essential. There is the issue, for example, on when there's an offender in the congregation, who needs to know? And congregations vary tremendously in their decisions about that. In a very small congregation, if there are 40 or 50 members and something hits, there's an internet sting and it hits the press, well, everyone's going to know. In other congregations, and my congregation has over 500 people, the way our particular policy is written is that we let the congregation know every year if there is somebody who is on a limited access agreement, or how many somebodies, or if there's nobody on a limited access agreement right now, and that's all the information that becomes public.
Great. I just want to say, Debra, there's just some fantastic questions coming in. I'm having a hard time choosing which ones here. So, but I want to say this next one is just a little bit, just changing gears here a little bit, but one woman asked, what's your experience, Debra, with the Black African American churches on the subject? Both, what their participation may be, or any sort of particular challenges they may be experiencing. So I wonder if you have anything to say about your work with that group.
So I have a couple of different answers. We know that breaking the silence around sexuality has been particularly difficult in some of the historically Black churches and some of the historically Latino churches, where sexuality is simply not discussed. And so starting that conversation, equipping parents to talk to their children, is often an entryway. We are very interested in, and yet have not had success in helping in getting congregations from places like the Progressive Baptist Association or the AMEZs involved in this effort. We did include them in the surveys that we did, and so they're represented among the congregations and the denominations that, frankly, like the Reformed Jews and some of the main lines, has not really made this a significant priority. And so I think we need to look at how do we break the silence. Interestingly, the experts that we convened, one of the questions that we raised with this group is, how do these criteria need to be tailored depending on, is the congregation a predominantly white congregation, predominantly African-American, predominantly Latino? Is it a congregation that, like the MCC churches, predominantly serves gay and lesbian people? What kind of differences does culture make when it comes to abuse prevention? And what our experts and what the literature seems to indicate is that, in fact, like the differences in theology, which really don't matter about how we keep children safe, would matter in terms of the cultural context of the education, but not that education should take place, or not that training shouldn't take place. But that the biggest difference in congregations has to do with size. The challenges on safer congregation is greatest in terms of implementation in our smaller congregations, where they don't have the money to put glass in all the windows. They don't have the money, they don't have the numbers of people to have 2 adults in the classroom. They don't have enough adolescents to have a list of trained babysitters, and so on. In fact, often, for example, in my denomination, many of our congregations are lay-led. They don't have professional leaders. And so the size, and this isn't something a sexologist usually says, but when it comes to this program, size really does matter. And that seems to be one of the prevailing differences in what needs to be adapted, rather than the cultural or demographic makeup of the congregation you're serving.
Thank you. And I know that there's probably a ton more you could say, so thank you for keeping it on relatively short side on that. I want to just jump back, actually. Someone had, I think, at least is hearing you say things like when and whether to involve authorities. And the question is, why would you ever fail to report disclosure of child sexual abuse? And so I think there's a slight mishearing of what you're saying, so I thought you might want to correct that.
So clearly, if one if one determines that there's child sexual abuse going on, that gets reported. But let me give an example. I was called in to give advice to a congregation, safe congregations policy, where somebody had seen a 12, 13-year-old girl who was leaning on her whose dad had his arm around her during services, and who was leaning her head on the dad's shoulder. And this parent, this other person in the congregation, reported that this seemed completely unnatural to her, and that we should investigate. It turned out this was a dad who had his daughter on the weekends. They had a physically close relationship that neither the child or the parent or the other parent felt was a concern, and it was a natural show of affection. So we need to be in a position where we are discerning what's actually going on in the situation, and to be that sort of front line of defense. Again, there's a Let me kind of say this. I think a hypersensitivity in some places, where people have, because of their concerns about these issues, have stopped hugging children, have stopped hugging congregants when they need to, have stopped offering pastoral touch, for fear of being misunderstood. And that's part of the things that I think need to come up in conversation in congregations about what's appropriate caring and touch and boundaries, and how do we let people set them for themselves rather than expecting that everybody in the congregation is comfortable with them. So, I mean, as another example, there are congregations where the assumption is that you're going to hug everybody at coffee hour. And certainly the people on this call know that not everybody wants to be hugged. And so just trying to shift the culture to have people understand that there are people who, either for their own historical reasons of being a victim of abuse, or because of how touch was handled in their family or their different cultural messages, don't want that kind of engagement, and that we need to learn to ask. And so, again, it's a matter of helping the people in charge have the ability to assess what's really going on in that situation. Would you add something to that?
No, I think that is a great sort of summary, and I think that the line that I usually talk about is that, certainly that if someone in the congregation is concerned about what's going on, they can always call their DCF, the Child Protective Services. They can always even offer a hypothetical and say, this is what's happening. Is this something worth reporting? And so if there is a question about whether or not to report, I usually recommend call the Child Protective Services and find out if it's something worth reporting. But what I love about congregations is you see a lot of behaviors that maybe of concern, but they really doesn't come up to the threshold of reporting, and that really gives an opportunity for the congregation to get involved in prevention. And I think that, to me, is what I find so hopeful about this work. I think, unfortunately, again, there's so many great questions, but I don't see any other ones that would be a short answer. So I think I'm going to have to sort of begin to wrap this up. But to say this is a great conversation to have. I really hope that people will go ahead and visit the Religious Institute and find out more about what kind of resources are out there. I also just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about that NERI Press. Also, to say that we have a free Research to Practice newsletter that, if you're on this webinar, we'll definitely send this to you. You can always unsubscribe if you don't want to, but it's a chance that we take to sort of take what is happening in the research, what are we seeing in the research, and then putting it into a one-page newsletter that we talk about. It's short enough to read over a cup of coffee, and hopefully make some of that research more accessible to the general community and to our public. I also want to say our next webinar is on May 5th. It's what we actually call our Consultinar, and this is with David Prescott and Steve Bengis. And what they will do, this is the third one we've tried, and it's great. It's a chance to focus on a really complex clinical case, and it's presented by a practicing clinician with comments and questions from David, the clinician, and Steve Bengis. So it's a wonderful conversation, and I really encourage you to attend. And if you have a particularly complex case, you can definitely contact Steve Bengis at NERI Press. Just send it to info@NERI Press, and you may be selected as our consulting clinician for that. I also want to thank the sponsors. As I said earlier, we could not do this if we didn't have the sponsors. It's really, like NPR, it's you who make these webinars possible. So I want to really take a special shout out to the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the ITM group, James Reynolds, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, Maple Tree Group Home, the New Hope for Treatment Centers, Ranch Elo Society, Stevens Treatment Program, Wayne County Juvenile Probation, the Aroke Counseling, Houston Transitions to Wellness and Counseling, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. We could not do it without you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, the cost for that is we think it's reasonable. It's $98 for individuals and $250 for organizations. You're guaranteed a seat at every webinar, and some of ours have sold out, so that's actually helpful. You get a certificate of completion, you get access to CE credits, and you get 2 NERI Press books with a value of actually $150. So it really is a wonderful, and we think of it as like a win-win situation for everyone. Also, a quick reminder that the PowerPoint slides are posted on our website, and a recording will be posted next week. We'll send you that notice when it is posted, along with some of the resources that people have shared with us. I also want to say that the CE credits are available, and also please remember to complete the evaluation. So when you sign out, a link will be sent to you to do that. And last and probably most importantly, I want to just say a huge thank you to everybody who participated today to share their resources, and an extra special thank you to Debra for such a great webinar. I love the conversation. I always love the conversations with you, and please, please everybody to stay in touch with us, but also stay in touch with Debra for the really great work that she's doing here. So we welcome everybody's feedback. Please be sure to complete your evaluation form when you close out the webinar. And again, Debra, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. And goodbye, everybody. Have a great afternoon.